In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal tradition echo through marble corridors, sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. On a crisp autumn morning in 2023, as Prince William stood frozen in the doorway of his private study, his shoulders trembling with the weight of unspoken grief, Princess Catherine did something that would later be called the most powerful act of love by royal experts worldwide. What happened in those 60 seconds would not make headlines immediately. No cameras captured it. No official statements were released. Yet this single, quiet moment would ripple through the monarchy, transforming not just a marriage, but the very future of the British royal family. The gesture was so simple, so human, that it reminded the world that beneath the crowns and ceremonies, behind the protocols and public appearances, beat the hearts of two people who had promised to stand by each other through everything life could throw at them. This is the story of how Princess Catherine's instinctive response to her husband's moment of vulnerability became a masterclass in royal partnership, earning praise from constitutional experts, relationship counselors, and millions of people around the world who recognized something profound in its quiet power. But, to understand why this moment mattered so much, we must first understand the extraordinary pressure that had been building in the Wales household, the challenges that had tested their bond, and the way one woman's intuitive wisdom would guide the future of the crown through its most uncertain chapter in decades. The morning began like countless others in the Wales family home at Adelaide Cottage. Prince William woke before dawn, as was his habit, the responsibility of his future role never allowing him the luxury of sleeping late. But, this particular October morning carried a different energy. Today would mark 3 months since King Charles had asked William to take on additional duties, preparing him more intensively for his eventual role as monarch. Catherine stirred beside him, her hand instinctively reaching across the bed to touch his arm. Even in sleep, she seemed to sense when the weight of his responsibilities pressed heavier than usual. William looked at her peaceful face in the early morning light, grateful for this woman who had somehow learned to navigate the impossible balance between being his wife and supporting his destiny. The previous evening had been difficult. William had spent hours in his study, poring over briefings about constitutional matters, economic challenges, and diplomatic situations that would soon become his to handle. The transition of power, even though it was still years away, required careful preparation. Every decision he would make as future king would affect millions of lives, and the magnitude of that responsibility sometimes felt overwhelming. Catherine had found him there at midnight, still reading, his shoulders tense with concentration. She had not said much, simply brought him tea and sat quietly in the chair beside his desk, occasionally reaching over to touch his hand when she noticed his breathing becoming shallow with stress. Her presence had been enough to calm him, but William knew she worried about the increasing pressure he was under. As they prepared for the day, their 3 children chattering excitedly about their school activities, William felt the familiar tug between his roles as father and future king. Prince George, now 10 years old, was beginning to understand his own future responsibilities, and William could see the questions forming in his eldest son's eyes. How do you prepare a child for a life they never chose? How do you give them a normal childhood while also preparing them for anything but normal? Princess Charlotte, spirited and intelligent at 8, seemed to sense the undercurrents of tension in the household. She had begun asking more questions about why Papa had to work so much, why there were always serious men in suits coming to the house for meetings. Her perceptiveness reminded William of Catherine at that age, according to the stories his wife's parents had shared. Even as a child, Catherine had possessed an uncanny ability to read the emotions of those around her. Prince Louis, still young at 5, remained blissfully unaware of the weight his family carried. His infectious laughter and boundless energy provided moments of lightness that William treasured. Watching his youngest son race around the garden, completely free and joyful, sometimes brought William to tears. How long before Louis, too, would need to understand the sacrifices their family name required? The drive to their official engagement that morning was unusually quiet. Catherine sat beside William in the royal car, occasionally glancing at his profile as he stared out the window at the countryside passing by. She knew he was processing the conversation they had had the night before, when he had finally voiced the fears that had been eating at him for months. "What if I am not ready?" he had asked her, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I become king and I make decisions that hurt people? What if I fail them the way?" He had not finished the sentence, but Catherine knew he was thinking about his father's long wait for the throne, about his mother's tragic death, about all the ways the monarchy had been tested over the years. Catherine had taken his hands in hers that night, looking directly into his eyes. "You will never be alone in this," she had told him. "Whatever comes, we face it together. That is what we promised each other, and that is what I mean." The conviction in her voice had surprised even her, but she realized she had never been more certain of anything in her life. The official engagement was a visit to a new community center in a town that had struggled with economic hardship. As they walked through the facility, meeting volunteers and local residents, Catherine watched William transform. This was where he shined, where the weight of his future responsibilities translated into genuine care for the people he would one day serve. An elderly woman approached William, taking his hands in her weathered ones. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "It means everything to us that you see us, that you care." William's eyes misted, and Catherine saw him swallow hard before responding with characteristic warmth and sincerity. This is what it is all about, Catherine thought to herself, watching her husband listen intently to a young father explaining the struggles of finding work in the area. William was not just going through the motions of royal duty, he was genuinely invested in understanding how he could help. This was the man who would be king, and, despite his doubts, Catherine could see clearly that he was exactly what the country needed. But she also saw the toll it was taking on him. The constant balancing act between public duty and private family life, the pressure to always say the right thing, to never show weakness or uncertainty, was wearing him down. William had always been conscientious, but since taking on these additional responsibilities, he had become almost obsessive about getting everything right. During the car ride home, Catherine made a decision. She turned to William, who was reviewing notes from their visit, always working, always preparing. "William," she said gently, and something in her tone made him look up immediately. "You know you do not have to carry all of this alone, right? I am here. I will always be here." He smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all day. "I know," he said, reaching for her hand. "I do not know what I would do without you." But Catherine could see that he was still struggling, still trying to figure out how to balance the enormous expectations placed on him with his desire to be a good husband and father. That evening, after the children were in bed, William retreated to his study again. Catherine watched him go, knowing he would be there for hours, preparing for tomorrow's responsibilities. She had learned not to interrupt these sessions unless absolutely necessary, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she sensed that her husband needed something more than space to work. She waited an hour before going to check on him. The door to his study was slightly ajar, and she could see him sitting at his desk, but he was not reading or writing. He was simply staring at a photograph of his mother that sat on the corner of the desk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Catherine had seen him look at that photograph countless times over the years, but tonight there was something different in his posture, something that spoke of deep sadness and uncertainty. She realized that he was not just processing the responsibilities of his future role, he was grieving for the guidance he would never have, for the mother who would never see him become king. Without announcing her presence, Catherine quietly entered the room and settled into the chair beside his desk where she had sat the night before. She did not speak, did not try to fix or solve anything. She simply sat with him in his grief, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his emotions. After several minutes, William spoke without looking away from the photograph. "I keep wondering what she would tell me," he said softly. "About how to do this, how to be what the country needs while still being a good father, a good husband. She managed it all so beautifully, and I feel like I am stumbling through it." Catherine felt her heart break for him, but she also felt a surge of determination. This was her husband, her partner, the father of her children, and he was in pain. The quiet gesture she made next would change everything, though neither of them knew it at the time. The evening was setting the stage for the moment that would define not just their marriage, but their approach to royal duty for years to come. As Catherine sat beside her husband, watching him struggle with the weight of his destiny, she was already forming the response that would later earn praise from royal experts around the world. But first, William would need to find the courage to be completely vulnerable with her, and Catherine would need to find the wisdom to know exactly how to respond. The next morning brought news that would test everything William thought he knew about his ability to handle the pressures of his role. Catherine was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sharp intake of breath from the living room where William was reviewing the morning papers and official briefings that arrived each day. She found him standing motionless, a document trembling in his hands. The letter bore the official seal of the Prime Minister's office, and Catherine could see from William's expression that its contents were significant. Without a word, he handed her the letter, his face pale with shock. The document outlined a constitutional crisis that had been brewing behind closed doors for weeks. A series of complex political decisions required input from the royal family, and specifically from William as the future monarch. The Prime Minister was requesting a private meeting to discuss matters of national security and constitutional law that could affect the monarchy's role for generations to come. "They want me to make decisions about things I have only read about in theory," William said, his voice barely controlled. "Constitutional precedents that could change the entire relationship between the Crown and Parliament. How can I possibly know what is right? What if I choose wrong and damage the monarchy forever?" Catherine set the letter down and looked at her husband carefully. She had seen him stressed before, worried about his responsibilities, but this was different. This was fear, raw and overwhelming. The weight of centuries of royal tradition and the future of the institution was being placed on his shoulders, and he was questioning whether he was strong enough to carry it. The morning routine with the children became strained as William struggled to maintain his composure. George noticed immediately that something was wrong with his father, approaching him with the serious expression he wore when he was trying to understand adult concerns that affected his family. "Papa, are you worried about something?" George asked, settling beside William on the sofa where he was pretending to read but had been staring at the same page for 10 minutes. William looked at his son, this boy who would one day face even greater challenges, and felt a wave of protective sadness wash over him. "Just work things, George. Nothing for you to worry about." But George was too perceptive to be satisfied with that answer. "Is it because you will be king someday?" "Charlotte says that means you have to make important decisions that help people." The innocent directness of the question hit William like a physical blow. His 10-year-old son understood the basic concept that William was struggling with, but George could not possibly comprehend the complexity and weight of what lay ahead. How do you explain to a child that the decisions you make could affect millions of lives, that there is no guidebook for being a modern monarch, that every choice carries consequences that ripple through history? Catherine watched this interaction from the doorway, her heart aching for both her husband and her son. George was beginning to understand his own future, and William was terrified of the example he was setting. The pressure was becoming unbearable for everyone in the family. After the children left for school, William retreated to his study again, but this time Catherine followed him immediately. She found him standing at the window, looking out at the gardens but clearly seeing nothing. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and she realized he was having something close to a panic attack. "William," she said gently, moving to stand beside him. "You need to breathe slowly. Focus on my voice." He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that frightened her. It was not just stress or worry, it was despair. Her strong, capable husband, the man who had always seemed so sure of himself in public, was falling apart. "I cannot do this, Catherine," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I am not my mother. I am not built for this. Every decision I make will be scrutinized, criticized, analyzed for decades. What if I make choices that hurt people? What if I fail the country the way other monarchs have failed in the past?" Catherine felt her own fear rising, not because she doubted William's abilities, but because she could see how close he was to convincing himself that he was not worthy of the role that was his birthright. She realized that this moment would define not just their immediate future, but the entire trajectory of his reign. The morning passed in a blur of William trying to prepare for the meeting with the Prime Minister while battling his own self-doubt. Catherine watched him pace the study, picking up books on constitutional law, setting them down, starting to read briefings, then pushing them away in frustration. "There is so much I do not know," he said, more to himself than to her. "So much I should understand but do not. How can I advise the government on matters I have only studied in theory? How can I represent the people when I have lived such a privileged life that I cannot truly understand their struggles? Catherine recognized that her husband was spiraling into a dark place where his natural self-reflection was becoming destructive self-criticism. She had seen this pattern before during difficult periods in their marriage, but never with such intensity. The pressure of his future role was threatening to crush the very qualities that would make him a great king. The phone call from the Prime Minister's office came at noon, confirming the meeting for that afternoon and adding additional items to the agenda that made William's face go even paler. Constitutional experts would be present, along with senior civil servants and political advisors. William would be expected to demonstrate his understanding of complex legal and political issues that could affect the monarchy for generations. After hanging up the phone, William stood frozen in the middle of his study, his hands shaking slightly. Catherine watched him struggle with the magnitude of what was being asked of him, and she realized that something fundamental was shifting in their relationship. For the first time since they had been married, William was truly vulnerable in a way that went beyond normal stress or worry. "I feel like I am drowning," he admitted, sitting down heavily in his chair. "Every time I think I understand something, 10 more complex issues appear. The constitutional lawyers speak in language I studied at university but never had to apply in reality. The political advisors assume I understand precedents that I have only read about in books." Catherine moved closer to him, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes. "You are not supposed to know everything immediately, William. This is why they are giving you time to prepare, why there are experts to advise you." But William shook his head. "You do not understand the pressure, Catherine. When I am king, the decisions stop with me. I can consult advisors, but ultimately, I have to make choices that I will have to live with forever. What if I make the wrong choice? What if I damage the monarchy or hurt the country?" The raw fear in his voice broke Catherine's heart. She realized that her husband was not just struggling with the responsibilities of his future role, he was grappling with the fundamental question of whether he was worthy of being king. The self-doubt that had always been part of his character was threatening to overwhelm his natural leadership abilities. As the afternoon approached and the time for the crucial meeting drew near, Catherine watched William prepare with a mixture of determination and dread. He reviewed his notes one more time, straightened his tie, and tried to compose himself into the confident royal persona that the public expected to see. But Catherine could see the cracks in his composure, the way his hands trembled slightly as he gathered his papers, the way his breathing remained shallow and rapid. She realized that this meeting would either strengthen his confidence in his abilities or potentially shatter his belief in himself completely. Standing in the doorway of his study, watching him prepare for one of the most important meetings of his life, Catherine knew that everything was about to change. The quiet gesture that would earn praise from royal experts around the world was still hours away, but the foundation for that moment was being laid right here, right now, as William faced his deepest fears about his ability to serve his country. The weight of the future was pressing down on both of them, but Catherine was beginning to understand that her role in supporting William through this crisis would require more than just being present. It would require her to find a way to help him see himself the way she saw him, to remind him of his strengths when all he could see were his weaknesses. As William left for the meeting that would test his readiness for kingship, Catherine realized that the most important moment of their marriage was still to come, and she would need to be ready for it. William returned from the meeting that evening looking like a different person. Catherine heard the car pull up the drive and watched from the window as her husband sat motionless in the back seat for several long minutes before finally getting out. His usually perfect posture was slumped, his shoulders rounded with defeat. She met him at the door, searching his face for clues about how the meeting had gone. What she saw there made her stomach drop. This was not just disappointment or frustration, this was devastation. Without saying a word, William walked past her toward his study, his steps heavy and uncertain. Catherine followed him, her heart pounding with worry. She found him standing in the middle of the room, still wearing his coat, staring at nothing. The silence stretched between them until she could not bear it any longer. "William, what happened?" she asked softly. He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It was not just sadness or fear, it was a deep, crushing sense of inadequacy that seemed to have settled into his very bones. "I failed," he said simply. They asked me about constitutional precedents from the 18th century, about legal frameworks I had never heard of, about political implications I never considered. I sat there feeling like a child pretending to understand grown-up conversations. Catherine moved closer, but William held up his hand to stop her. The worst part was watching their faces. These brilliant legal minds, political experts who have spent decades studying these issues, and they could see that I was out of my depth. The future King of England, and I could not answer basic questions about how the monarchy functions in constitutional crises. The defeat in his voice was total. Catherine realized that this meeting had not just challenged William's knowledge, it had attacked the very foundation of his confidence in his ability to serve as monarch. All the fears he had been battling for months had been confirmed in one devastating afternoon. They were polite, of course, William continued, his voice hollow. Professional. But I could see the concern in their eyes. The Prime Minister actually suggested that perhaps I needed more time to prepare, more intensive tutoring in constitutional law. More time. As if time could fix the fact that I am simply not intelligent enough for this role. Catherine felt anger rising in her chest, not at William, but at the situation that had reduced her capable, thoughtful husband to this broken version of himself. She wanted to argue with him, to point out all the ways he was wrong about his abilities, but she could see that he was too deep in his despair to hear logical arguments. I keep thinking about my mother, William said, slumping into his chair. She was naturally brilliant at this. People always said she had an intuitive understanding of what the monarchy needed to be, how to balance tradition with modernity. I do not have that intuition. I study and prepare and still feel lost. The mention of Diana hit Catherine like a physical blow. She understood now that William was not just struggling with his current responsibilities, he was comparing himself to an idealized memory of his mother and finding himself lacking. The pressure of living up to Diana's legacy was crushing him. Catherine sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. Your mother was extraordinary, William, but she was not born knowing how to be royal. She learned, just like you are learning. And she made mistakes too, even though history remembers her more kindly now. But William shook his head. You did not see me today, Catherine. I stammered through answers to questions I should have known. I asked for clarification on concepts that any future monarch should understand instinctively. They probably left that meeting wondering if the monarchy has a future with me as its head. The self-criticism was becoming so harsh that Catherine felt she was watching her husband disappear before her eyes. This man who had always been her anchor, her steady partner in navigating the complexities of royal life, was questioning everything about himself. What if I abdicate? William said suddenly, the words hanging in the air like a bomb. What if I step aside and let George inherit directly from my father when the time comes? Maybe the monarchy would be better served by skipping my generation entirely. Catherine felt the world tilt around her. She had known William was struggling, but she had not realized he was considering abandoning his birthright entirely. The idea of abdication was so foreign to everything William believed about duty and service that hearing him voice it told her just how completely his confidence had been shattered. You do not mean that, she said, but her voice came out weaker than she intended. I do, William replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I have been thinking about it all afternoon. The monarchy is bigger than any one person, bigger than me. If I am not suited for the role, if I cannot serve the country the way it deserves to be served, then maybe the most patriotic thing I can do is step aside. Catherine stared at her husband, this man she had fallen in love with partly because of his deep sense of duty and commitment to service, talking about abandoning everything he had been raised to believe in. She realized that the meeting had not just challenged his competence, it had made him question his entire identity. What about George? She asked quietly. What about the children? You would be asking your son to carry this burden without ever having the chance to learn from you, to grow into the role gradually. William's face crumpled at the mention of their children. Maybe that would be better for him too. Maybe he would be better off living a normal life, free from all of this pressure and expectation. Maybe I could save him from this. Catherine felt something break inside her chest. The William she knew, the man who had always seen his future role as a privilege and a responsibility, was talking about his birthright as if it were a curse he could pass on to his son or escape from entirely. The pressure had not just overwhelmed him, it had fundamentally changed how he saw himself and his purpose. The evening passed in a blur of William continuing to spiral deeper into self-doubt while Catherine tried desperately to find the right words to reach him. But everything she said seemed to bounce off the wall of despair he had built around himself. Her logical arguments about his capabilities, her reminders of his successful engagements and the positive impact he had on people, her assurances that learning was a process, all fell on deaf ears. As night fell and the children were put to bed, Catherine found herself facing a crisis she had never imagined. Her husband, the future king, was seriously considering abdication because one difficult meeting had convinced him he was not worthy of the throne. Everything they had built together, everything they had planned for their family and their service to the country, was hanging in the balance. William spent the evening in his study, supposedly reading, but Catherine could see from the doorway that he was just sitting, staring, lost in his own thoughts. The confident, capable man she had married seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Late that night, as Catherine lay in bed unable to sleep, she heard William moving around downstairs. She found him in the kitchen, making tea with shaking hands, his hair disheveled and his eyes red with exhaustion. "I cannot sleep," he said without looking at her. "Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces from today. The disappointment, the concern. I keep thinking about all the ways I let them down." Catherine realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for without knowing it. Everything in their relationship, everything she had learned about supporting William through difficult times, had led to this crisis point. Her response now would determine not just William's future as king, but the future of their marriage and their family. Standing in their kitchen in the middle of the night, watching her husband struggle with the deepest crisis of confidence he had ever faced, Catherine knew that the quiet gesture that would change everything was about to happen. But first, William would need to find the courage to be completely honest about his fears, and Catherine would need to find the wisdom to know exactly how to respond. The moment that would earn praise from royal experts around the world was still hours away, but the foundation for it was being laid right here, right now, in the quiet darkness of their home, as two people who loved each other faced the most challenging test their marriage had ever endured. The following morning arrived gray and somber, matching the mood that had settled over their household. Catherine woke to find William's side of the bed empty, the sheets cold. She found him in his study, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by constitutional law books and historical documents. He had clearly been there all night, trying to cram decades of knowledge into his exhausted mind. "William," she said gently from the doorway, "you need to get some rest." He looked up at her with hollow eyes. "I have been reading about the abdication crisis of 1936. Edward VIII gave up the throne for love, but what if someone gave up the throne for the good of the country? What if that would be the more noble choice?" Catherine's heart sank. Instead of the night providing clarity or renewed determination, it had only deepened William's conviction that he was not suitable for the crown. She watched him turn back to his books, his shoulders hunched with defeat, and realized that traditional reassurance was not going to reach him. The morning routine with the children became increasingly strained. George and Charlotte both noticed their father's strange behavior, the way he seemed distracted and sad even when he was trying to engage with them. Louis, still young enough to be oblivious to the undercurrents, provided the only bright moments as he chattered about his upcoming school project. "Papa, will you help me with my presentation about castles?" Louis asked, climbing onto William's lap as he sat at the breakfast table, mechanically eating toast he clearly could not taste. William's face softened slightly as he looked at his youngest son. "Of course, Louis. What do you need to know about castles?" "Everything," Louis exclaimed with 5-year-old enthusiasm. "I want to know about kings and queens and how they helped people and made important decisions." The innocent request hit William like a physical blow. Catherine watched her husband struggle to maintain composure as his son unknowingly described exactly the role William was convinced he could not fulfill. The conversation that should have been joyful became another reminder of his perceived inadequacies. After the children left for school, William retreated to his study once again. Catherine gave him space, hoping that some time alone might help him process his feelings, but when she checked on him an hour later, she found him in exactly the same position, staring at the same page of a constitutional law textbook. "William," she said, settling into the chair beside his desk, "you have been reading the same page for an hour." He looked at her with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past 2 days. "I cannot concentrate. Every time I try to focus on the material, I hear the questions from yesterday that I could not answer. I keep thinking about how much I do not know, how much I should know but do not." Catherine studied her husband's face, seeing the deep lines of exhaustion and stress that had appeared seemingly overnight. This was not just about the difficult meeting anymore, this was about William's entire sense of self-worth and identity. The pressure of his future role had triggered something deeper, a fundamental questioning of whether he was worthy of the trust placed in him. "What if we took a break from all of this?" Catherine suggested gently. "Maybe a walk in the gardens, or we could drive out to see your father. Sometimes talking to someone who understands the pressure can help." But William shook his head immediately. "I cannot face my father right now. What would I tell him? That his heir is considering abdication because he is not smart enough to be king? That everything he has taught me, all the preparation he has provided, has been wasted on someone who simply does not have what it takes?" The self-loathing in his voice was so intense that Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes. This man who had always been so strong, so steady, was completely falling apart. She realized that she was witnessing something more than stress or worry. This was a complete crisis of identity that threatened to destroy everything William believed about himself. Around midday, Catherine made a decision that would prove to be crucial. Instead of continuing to try to talk William out of his despair, she simply sat with him. She brought her own work to his study and settled quietly in the chair beside his desk, not trying to fix or solve anything, just being present while he struggled. For 2 hours, they sat in companionable silence. William occasionally turned pages in his book, though Catherine could tell he was not really reading. Sometimes he would start to say something, then stop, the words dying in his throat. Catherine worked on correspondence, answered emails, and maintained her calm presence while her husband battled his demons. It was during this quiet time together that Catherine began to understand something important. William's crisis was not really about his competence or intelligence. It was about his fear of failing the people who depended on him, his terror of making decisions that could hurt others, his overwhelming sense of responsibility for outcomes he could not completely control. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine noticed subtle changes in William's demeanor. The frantic energy that had characterized his behavior for the past 2 days was giving way to exhausted calm. He stopped pretending to read and simply sat, occasionally looking at her with something that might have been gratitude. "You do not have to stay here with me," he said quietly. "I know you have other things to do." Catherine looked up from her work and met his eyes directly. "There is nowhere else I would rather be," she said simply. And, in that moment, she meant it completely. Whatever was happening with William, whatever he was struggling with, she wanted to be part of it, not because she could fix it, but because they were partners in everything. As evening approached, William finally closed the book he had been pretending to read and looked at Catherine with something approaching clarity for the first time in days. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said yesterday. About not having to carry all of this alone." Catherine felt a spark of hope but tried not to show too much eagerness. "What about it?" "I think I have been so focused on trying to be perfect, trying to know everything before I am asked, that I forgot something important. The monarchy is not a solo performance. It is a partnership, not just with you, but with advisors, with Parliament, with the people themselves." Catherine nodded, encouraging him to continue without pushing too hard. "Maybe the meeting yesterday was not a test of whether I know everything already, but a demonstration of how much I still need to learn. And maybe that is okay. Maybe admitting what I do not know is actually more honest and more useful than pretending to have all the answers." Catherine felt her heart lift slightly, but she could see that William was still fragile, still working through the implications of this shift in perspective. She remained quiet, letting him process his thoughts at his own pace. "I have been thinking about my mother again," William continued, his voice gaining some strength. "Not just about how perfect she seemed, but about how she actually lived her royal role. She did not pretend to know everything. She asked questions, she learned from people, she was not afraid to admit when she was out of her depth. Catherine watched her husband slowly begin to reconstruct his understanding of what it meant to be royal, what it meant to serve. This was not the dramatic recovery she might have hoped for, but it was genuine progress, a real shift in how he was thinking about his future responsibilities. The moment that would change everything was still hours away, but Catherine could see that the foundation was being laid. William was beginning to see his vulnerability not as a disqualifying weakness, but as a human quality that might actually make him a better king. The quiet gesture that would earn praise from royal experts around the world was about to emerge from this new understanding, but first, William needed to take one more step toward accepting himself as he was, rather than as he thought he should be. As they sat together in the growing darkness of his study, Catherine realized that the most important moment of their marriage was approaching, and she was finally beginning to understand what her role in it would be. The next morning brought unexpected news that would provide the perfect opportunity for Catherine's quiet gesture to reveal its true power. A last-minute addition to their schedule had been requested by a local hospice that was struggling with funding cuts. The visit was not mandatory, and, given William's current state of mind, Catherine expected him to decline. Instead, William surprised her by accepting immediately. "Maybe this is exactly what I need," he said, and Catherine heard something different in his voice, a tentative determination that had not been there for days. As they prepared for the visit, Catherine watched William with new eyes. He was still fragile, still processing the crisis of confidence he had experienced, but something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer trying to pretend he was unaffected by his struggles, and, paradoxically, this honesty seemed to make him stronger. During the drive to the hospice, William was unusually quiet, but it was a thoughtful silence rather than the desperate brooding of the previous days. Catherine could sense him preparing himself not just for the engagement, but for a different way of approaching his royal duties. "I have been thinking about what you said," William said suddenly, as they neared their destination. "About not having to carry everything alone. I realized that I have been so afraid of appearing weak or unprepared that I have been isolating myself from the very people who could help me." Catherine felt a flutter of hope but remained quiet, sensing that William needed to work through these thoughts himself. "Today, I want to try something different," he continued. "Instead of pretending I have all the answers, I want to ask questions. I want to learn from the people we meet, instead of feeling like I have to impress them with what I already know." As they arrived at the hospice, Catherine watched William transform in real time. Instead of his usual careful composure, he approached the visit with genuine curiosity and openness. When the facility director began explaining the challenges they faced, William asked thoughtful questions that went beyond polite interest. "What would make the biggest difference to the patients here?" he asked, leaning forward with genuine attention. "Not just funding, but what would truly improve their daily experience?" The director, clearly surprised by the depth of the question, began sharing insights that went far beyond the prepared talking points. Catherine watched as William engaged with a kind of presence she had not seen from him in months, fully focused on understanding rather than performing. During their tour of the facility, Catherine witnessed something remarkable. William met with patients and families, but, instead of delivering the usual royal pleasantries, he listened with an intensity that seemed to energize everyone around him. When an elderly man shared his concerns about leaving his wife alone, William did not offer empty reassurances but asked thoughtful questions about what support systems existed. "My husband always worries about being a burden," the man's wife said, and William nodded with understanding that clearly came from personal experience. "It is difficult when you care about someone and you cannot fix everything for them," William replied quietly. "But sometimes just being present, just caring, is more valuable than we realize." Catherine felt her breath catch. William was speaking from his own recent experience of feeling inadequate, but, instead of seeing this as a weakness, he was using it to connect authentically with people who were facing their own struggles with control and helplessness. The real transformation happened during their conversation with a young mother who was spending her final weeks at the hospice. She was concerned about how her 8-year-old daughter would remember her, worried that the child would only have memories of illness and sadness. William sat beside the woman's bed, and Catherine saw him struggle with emotion before speaking. "My mother died when I was 15, he said softly. I spent years worrying that I would forget her voice, her laugh, all the good times we had before she became ill. But the memories that stayed with me were not about her death, they were about how she made me feel loved and understood. The woman's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness.
Do you really think that is what she will remember? The love rather than the loss?
I am certain of it, William said with quiet conviction.
Love is stronger than loss, always. Catherine realized she was witnessing something unprecedented.
William was not just offering comfort to this woman, he was sharing his own vulnerability and pain as a gift, using his personal struggles to provide genuine help to someone who needed it desperately. After they left the hospice, William was quiet again, but this time Catherine could sense that he was processing the experience with wonder rather than worry. As they drove home, he finally spoke.
"Did you see what happened back there?" he asked, his voice filled with something Catherine had not heard in days, excitement.
When I stopped trying to be the perfect royal and just tried to be human, everything became easier.
More real. More helpful.
Catherine felt her heart soar, but she remained calm, not wanting to overwhelm this fragile new understanding with too much enthusiasm. The woman with the daughter, William continued, I could help her because I had experienced something similar. My struggles, my fears about not being good enough, they were not weaknesses that disqualified me from serving. They were experiences that helped me understand what others were going through. That evening, as William played with their children, Catherine saw her husband returning to himself, but it was a stronger, more authentic version than before. He was still the dedicated father and committed future king, but he was no longer trying to be perfect. He was simply trying to be present, to be honest, to be helpful. The quiet gesture that would earn praise from royal experts around the world finally happened that night, though it was so natural and subtle that even Catherine almost missed its significance. William was putting Louis to bed, reading him a story about a prince who was afraid he was not brave enough to be king. Louis, with the directness of a 5-year-old, asked, Papa, are you afraid to be king someday? Catherine, listening from the hallway, held her breath. A week ago, this question would have sent William spiraling into renewed anxiety about his inadequacies. Instead, she heard him answer with calm honesty. Sometimes I am afraid, Louis, William said quietly. Being king means making important decisions that affect many people, and I want to make good choices.
But, you know what helps when I am afraid?
What, Papa?
Remembering that I do not have to be perfect.
I just have to care about people and try my best to help them. And I have Mama to help me, and advisors to teach me, and people like you to remind me what really matters. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized what had just happened. William had found a way to be completely honest about his fears while also expressing confidence in his ability to grow and learn. He was modeling for his son that vulnerability and strength could exist together, that admitting uncertainty was not the same as admitting defeat. Later that evening, as Catherine and William sat together in his study, she made the quiet gesture that would later be analyzed and praised by constitutional experts, relationship counselors, and royal commentators around the world. Without fanfare or announcement, Catherine quietly moved the chair she had been occupying for the past few days to a position directly beside William's desk chair, rather than across from it. It was a subtle physical change, but its symbolism was profound. From now on, she said simply, settling into the repositioned chair, we face everything together. Not me supporting you from across the room, but us, side by side, as partners in every decision, every challenge, every responsibility. William looked at the new arrangement, then at his wife, and Catherine saw understanding dawn in his eyes. This was not about her taking over or sharing his constitutional role, but about them approaching the massive responsibility of the monarchy as a true partnership, with her wisdom and support available to him always. Together, William repeated quietly, and Catherine heard in his voice not just agreement, but profound relief. He was no longer carrying the weight of the future alone. Royal experts would later call this quiet gesture a masterclass in royal partnership, noting how Catherine had found a way to provide support without undermining William's authority, to share the burden without overstepping constitutional boundaries. But, for Catherine, it was simply the natural expression of what she had always known, that love shows up most powerfully not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of complete presence and support. The transformation was complete, not because William had suddenly gained all the knowledge he thought he lacked, but because he had learned that his worthiness as a future king was not based on his perfection, but on his character, his commitment to service, and his willingness to continue learning and growing. And Catherine had shown him, through her quiet gesture and unwavering presence, that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would never face them alone.